I believe that we should embrace an ideology to some extent. If we embrace an ideology that is all the way to the right, we will end up like fascist Germany did in the 1930s, where they are scapegoating Jews and blaming them for the debt they acquired through the Treaty of Versailles. This often included having to go to death camps or work camps where they were worked until they were died or considered useless citizens. The people who were not sent to death camps were treated with great inequality, as they could not run storefronts and they would almost end up dying by themselves. But if we go all the way to the left, we end up like the Soviets during the USSR era, where there was so much indoctrination from the government under Stalin that he convinced his people that mass starvation and purges were okay. As well, if we embrace an ideology all the way in the middle of the spectrum, we end up with citizens who have closed minds and are not willing to adapt to the world as the world changes around them. But if we don't embrace any ideologies at all, we are vulnerable to the extreme governments that will come into place over time, as well as we have nothing to base our laws off of, so it becomes very tricky to have a government. Not to mention that ideology is a very strong component in many people's identity. I personally embrace an ideology pretty strongly, but I'm also aware that ideologies need to change with the world because we are in an environment that is always changing. As well, I know that one ideology is not right for everyone and that the world should not embrace a single ideology. I believe that we should embrace the idea of collectivism completely, where everything is shared, including economic wealth, public property, which leads to everyone being equal before the law and towards each other, as well as it limits the suffering of people due to lack of wealth and ability to purchase goods. As Marx said in his book, The Communist Manifesto, it must be a dictatorship of the proletariat, which means a dictatorship of the people. In our society, we have only seen dictatorships of people with extreme power, where only one or two people hold the power, which leads to not a true communist regime, which is why I believe that we should not actually embrace it. Rather, we need to introduce some ideas of individualism, such as a free market capitalism idea on some products to make sure people have motivation to work, as well as money to spend to buy luxuries that they might enjoy. As well as we will introduce competition, which lowers prices and leads to people being able to afford more things with the money they have. But if we introduce too much individualism, we end up with an increased poverty gap as well as an increased wage gap. Not to mention, it becomes much harder for COVID or other pandemic relief, as there is very little government control and very little they can do to help. I believe that we should never fully embrace collectivism or individualism, but I think we should fall more on the scale of collectivism. Liberalism is an always changing scale that is sliding from left to right. Many historians believed it started when Thomas Hobbes stated that divine right was not a thing and that God did not actually place kings in power. Rather, if a king was not representing the will of the people, he was bad and should be kicked out. Next, along came Rousseau, and he believed that a nation should be democratic and should vote for their leaders. He also believed that humans were good and stated this in his quote, "Humans are born free, and everywhere man is in chains." Next, along came Montesquieu. He worked off of Rousseau's ideas and stated that there should be 3 levels of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. This was very important as it would help them not fall into the regime they were currently living under. Next came John Locke. He believed that the government's only job should be to protect life, liberty, and property. Next was John Stuart Mill. He believed many of the same things, except for he also believed in free speech and the harm principle, stating that a man should be able to do whatever he wants as long as it does not affect another man. Lastly, we see Adam Smith. He was economically against crown corporations and believed in self-interest and competition. This was built with the intention of helping out the small little companies who were struggling at the time, rather than the big companies we see it helping today. All of this is known as classical liberalism, and it was very, very left-wing for the time, but now we often see it as a right-wing idea that lines up with many conservatives right now. Through the Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, the World Wars, the labor unions, the stock market crash, and the Great Depression, as well as the shirtwaist factory, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Hoover, Keynes, Milton Friedman, and Ayn Rand, we have seen a transition to modern liberalism. This is where we have the left-wing liberals, often referred to as socialists, and we have the right-wing conservatives, who are referred to as capitalism. As COVID has hit, we have seen a great slide left for every country and every economic background. However, this is only temporary, as liberalism is a sliding scale that will never stop changing. The first quote I have chosen to use is from Robert Owen, and he states, "To train and educate the rising generation will at all times be the first objective of our society, to which every other will be subordinate." Although this quote is directly taken from the context of Robert Owen recently purchasing a town and running a social experiment on it where he tries out utopian socialism, I do not believe that this quote only applies to that. Rather, my ideology believes that everyone should have and deserves an equal start, which is also evident in this quote, saying that everyone will be educated, therefore giving them an equal opportunity to thrive in their adulthood. As well, from a study in Valparaiso University, they found out that people who were exposed to broad information ended up happier and more successful in the future, which are also very important things in creating a society that is happy and successful. As well, this will remove a rigid class structure that our society has been struggling with ever since day one, where either you're born wealthy, or you're born educated, or you're not, and there's very little chance for you. The other quote I have decided to use is from FDR, when he states, "To test our progress is not whether we add more abundance to those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." It is important to note that FDR is the most left American president, as well as during this time they saw an increase in socialism in this country. But I believe that this quote is very important because prosperity needs to include all citizens, not just the very rich tech giants that we have been seeing in modern times. As well, no citizen should be overlooked because they were not born into the right family, because we never know the potential that someone has. I believe the main reason people reject liberalism is out of desperation. This is evident in the way that Hitler rose to power. It all started when Germany was assigned extreme crippling debt through the treaties of Versailles because they were blamed for causing World War I. And because of the debt, they had lost all of their economic power that they used to have. And this was a very important part to many German citizens at the time. So, when Hitler came along, he promised to bring that economic power back, which he did, but at a great cost that we all know about today. A current rejection of liberalism is happening in the United States right now. I say this because of what happened with the Black Lives Matter protest in the spring of 2020. We saw the killing of George Floyd, and it took over 1 month for his killers to be arrested, despite the violent and peaceful protests that occurred. During this same time period, we saw the killing of Breonna Taylor, and we are yet to see any action on her case taken towards arresting the police officers. Most nations who resist liberalism do so because it is not the best option for them. This is evident in the way that Europeans came over to Canada and the United States and forced their ideas of liberalism on the Indigenous people. However, these people had been living peacefully and very simply before we came in a way that worked for them, and we have seen problems in their culture rise the more that we force liberalism on them. I believe that the most significant consequence of the post-World War II era was the long-lasting fear that existed during the Cold War. As many know, the Cold War lasted for upwards of 45 years. As a result, the Americans who were living in a capitalist-style government, as well as the people under the USSR who were living in a communist-style government, were both building bomb shelters underground because they were so afraid that their countries were going to break out into a nuclear war that would end up killing everyone above ground. As well, both nations would not allow citizens from the other country into their own country out of fear that these people may be terrorists or spies that were going to ruin the war. In terms of the smaller countries who were not directly involved in this conflict, it was very, very crippling to them economically and physically. This is because many, many proxy wars took place here. One example is the Vietnam War. Not to mention there was upwards of 2 million deaths. There was a democratic South that lost this war, meaning that the whole country now is in a communist dictatorship that is ruining very great populations. As well, there is a continuing economic downturn because upwards of 500,000 kilometers of farmland was lost, as well as 5 million acres of forest land. Not to mention the political isolation that has occurred under this new communist regime. I believe that the government should play a strong role in narrowing the income gap and wage gap between citizens in democratic societies. This should be done by highly taxing the rich citizens in order to give all citizens the ability to have a shelter and a sustainable diet based on healthy foods. This may result in some middle-class citizens being taxed into a lower class. However, this is worth it if it means that more people are able to eat and not worry about where they're going to sleep at night. The government should have some intervention in economic affairs, because we learned if they don't, we will see things such as the 1929 stock market crash. But if they have too much, we will see some things similar to the USSR, where the government is causing famines, withholding money and products just because it benefits the government. As well, we have seen in recent history the Korean dictator Kim Jong-un forcing people into internment camps whenever he wants because he has all the power. Ideally, a government should intervene just enough for demand-side economics to work. This would result in giving some money to the very poor people. This would overall help the economy because now these people are going to spend more money than the rich would, who the money is being taken away from. I believe that Canada should always be promoting the ideas and principles of liberalism, because in promoting there is no force, there will be no harm, and a nation can choose to take it or leave it. A time where this happened was in Rwanda, when Canada joined the United Nations to promote liberalism and peace in this country during their genocide after the one-party president was murdered and there was massive rioting and there was no government to sustain this. I believe that Canada should only enforce liberalistic principles onto a country if the peace is greater in the end than it was at the beginning. A time in the history where this was a good thing is when Canada joined with the Allies to fight in World War II to defeat the Nazis. Despite over 45,000 Canadian deaths, this was worth it because there was a greater peaceful outcome in the end. A time where Canada should not have stepped in was when they joined the United Nations to help promote peace in Vietnam during the Vietnam War that occurred during the Cold War. This was bad because it did not work and it ended up turning half of Vietnam into a dictatorship where 40% of those people are starving. A time in the modern history where it was a good thing Canada stepped in is when they gave foreign aid of money and military to Haiti to fight off Papa Doc, the dictator that was in power in 1994. But again, in 2004, Haiti saw Aristide, another man who was trying to rise to a dictatorship. This time, we sent in forceful troops that killed over 5,000 people in this war. However, Aristide was killing 5,000 people a year, so this was a useful time to force liberalism on a nation. Modern liberal democratic societies represent the very will of the people to a very slim extent. However, they are the best option opposed to monarchs and dictatorships we have seen recently. And the citizens do have a say in their government through elections and referendums. However, recently we have seen extreme flaws in the electoral process, such as a great number of voter apathy, meaning only a very, very small portion of people who can vote are. This has shown in the United States in their 2016 election, they only had 55.7% of people who were able to vote do so. As well, the way that our voting system works, it is often not actually the will of the people represented in government. Such as in the United States in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton got 2.7 million more votes than Donald Trump did, yet because of the Electoral College, he won and got to hold the title of president. In Canada, it is possible for a party to win 30% of the votes but hold 100% of the seats. As well, because of this, our current leading government of the Liberals only have 157 out of 338 seats, despite the fact that less than 25% of our population voted for them in our previous election. Another reason that the electoral system is flawed is because over a quarter of Americans are unable to vote due to their age, felony convictions, and immigration. This leads to a very, very suppressed vote, leading to white votes being more popular. Many nations across the world have tried to fix this with mandatory voting. However, this would not work in the United States or Canada, as we have too much freedom and would probably oppose it. Not to mention, once a party member gets elected, they can do whatever they want within that span. There has been some recent consequences, such as members traveling outside of Canada being punished recently during the COVID restrictions, but other than that, there has been very little stopping of members doing what they want, even if it doesn't represent what their ridings would have wanted. The foundations of liberalism are good. The idea that people have a say in their government, as well as we decrease government, we often decrease government corruption, which is an unavoidable thing at this point in history. However, we need a much simpler system. The main reason is because of how complicated it is to pass a bill to become a law. That many of these bills, despite if they're good or bad, get lost because we just can't agree on anything in the Parliament or Senate these days. Not to mention, we have a lot of hidden government programs. In the United States, they had the CIA and the NSA. These were both created after 9/11 with the intentions of protecting people from terrorists. However, they were actually used to exploit people's information and to stalk them the way that we often see in China nowadays. This was brought out by Snowden, and he has been exiled to Russia because of how serious leaking this kind of government information is. Without the trust of the government and the people trusting the government, we are going to see a great deal of problems, such as heightened pandemics, because we don't trust the government this is real, and we don't trust that their protocols are for our best interest. As well, illiberalism will be greatly misunderstood. It will be viewed as taking away our rights rather than protecting us. This was a problem all the way back when Pierre Trudeau was in power and he had to take away some of the people's riots in order to protect them, but many people were rioting due to the fact that there was armies and troops in the streets. If we redefine liberalism and we build trust with our government, citizens will be able to understand the measures that are taken towards them and towards terrorism and all the other things that happen behind our backs that we don't understand and we end up misreading through the government. As well, with trust, we'll have more accountability to the government. This is a big thing right now as we are transitioning towards a climate that is failing our Earth very rapidly. We need people who can hold the government accountable to make sure that they stay true to the promises they make about cleaning up the environment in order for future generations to survive. As well, we often see the party members who campaign lose interest in what they campaigned about and just do what they want once they gain power. If we have trust in our government, we will have the freedom and honesty to speak up against them and hold them accountable to these things. I have learned 5 major lessons through Social 30 this semester. The first one being that everyone has an ideology and every ideology has flaws. Secondly, many, if not all, historical events are based on people pushing their ideologies onto each other because they believe that it is superior. This is evident in both the World Wars as well as almost all other wars, and the First Nations and the Europeans forcing their ideology on them. Third, you can never make everyone happy, no matter what your government is or as a person what you believe. Fourth, liberalism has been and will always be changing depending on what the world is doing and how people are reacting to it. And lastly, no leader is 100% truthful. Whether it is in a democracy or a dictatorship, every leader has something to hide, and we should never give 100% of our faith and trust to them.